I remember the moment like it was a compression point in space-time, one of those instants where years of risk, ridicule, sleepless nights, and stubborn optimism suddenly collapsed into a single outcome, and the world's numbers recalibrated around my name. And as I looked at the screen's flashing estimates of my net worth, climbing toward a figure no human being had ever touched before, roughly $750 billion, I didn't feel triumph so much as gravity, the weight of what it meant to bet everything on ideas that most people told me were reckless or impossible. Because this story didn't begin in a courtroom or a balance sheet. It began decades earlier with curiosity, with reading physics books on the floor, with asking why things are the way they are and how fast we can change them. And yet, here I was, watching a legal decision from Delaware ripple outward through markets and models, reinstating a Tesla compensation plan that had once been called outrageous, absurd, even immoral, but that was always designed as a moonshot contract, a set of targets so extreme that failure was the default outcome. And when the ruling came down, affirming that the bet had been knowingly made and legitimately earned, the markets reacted instantly. Tesla's valuation surged, my equity snapped back into place, and suddenly commentators were saying I was the richest person in history. Not just of this era, but of any era, surpassing the industrial titans and oil barons of the past. And what struck me most was how quickly the narrative flipped, because the same people who once said the pay package symbolized corporate excess now framed it as the natural reward for execution at scale. But from my perspective, it was never really about the money. Not in the emotional sense, because money is a tool, a scoreboard, a way of allocating resources toward improbable goals, and I've always been more interested in the goals themselves, making electric cars inevitable, turning rockets into reusable machines, building infrastructure for a multiplanetary species, defending free speech in the digital public square, and yes, sometimes breaking things along the way. And as my net worth leapt far beyond every other billionaire on the planet, creating a gap so large it almost looked fictional, I thought about how strange it is that wealth is treated like a personality trait rather than a byproduct, because no one ever talks about net worth when the rockets explode, or when production lines fail, or when you're sleeping on a factory floor wondering if payroll will clear, and yet those moments are the real price of entry, and the ruling didn't erase the years of doubt. It just acknowledged that the risk had been symmetrical, that the upside existed only because the downside was total. And I know there are people who will always be uncomfortable with one person controlling that much capital, and that's a valid concern in a world where systems matter more than individuals. But I also know that concentration of resources can accelerate outcomes that decentralized hesitation cannot. And when people ask me what it feels like to be the richest person who has ever lived, I want to tell them it feels exactly the same as before, because the real currency hasn't changed. It's still time, attention, and the fragile window we have to bend the trajectory of civilization towards something sustainable and expansive. And if history remembers this moment at all, I hope it's not as a story about a number, but as a reminder that audacious incentives tied to audacious goals can sometimes drag the future forward faster than anyone expects. And after the headlines settled and the analysts finished recalculating their spreadsheets, I found myself thinking less about the present valuation and more about the strange psychological lag between achievement and comprehension. Because when wealth spikes, that dramatically it creates the illusion of an overnight event, when in reality it's the delayed echo of decisions made years earlier. Decisions that looked irrational at the time, like agreeing to a compensation structure that paid nothing unless Tesla hit milestones so aggressive that even internal models treated them as edge cases. And I remember being told by lawyers, board members, critics, and strangers on the internet that no court would ever allow it to stand, that no company could grow into those numbers, that the whole thing would collapse under regulatory pressure or market gravity. And yet the ruling didn't just validate a contract, it validated a philosophy. The idea that incentives should be brutally aligned with outcomes, that leadership should eat last unless the mission succeeds at an extraordinary level. And when that alignment snapped back into place, the wealth followed automatically, like stored energy finally released. And what people don't see is that the number attached to my name is mostly illiquid, bound up in shares that rise and fall with execution, with factories that have to run, batteries that have to get cheaper, software that has to get safer, rockets that have to land upright instead of disintegrating into expensive confetti. And I'm acutely aware that the same mechanisms that pushed my net worth into uncharted territory can reverse just as fast if complacency sets in. Because history doesn't reward stasis, it rewards momentum. And being the richest person in history isn't a destination, it's a temporary label assigned by markets that are fundamentally impatient. And I've never optimized my life around being liked or understood in the moment. I've optimized around bending probability curves, and that often means accepting periods where the odds look terrible, where lawsuits pile up, where regulators circle, where critics sharpen knives. And then occasionally when the math finally resolves, the curve snaps upward and everyone acts surprised. But what matters to me now isn't widening the gap between myself and other billionaires. It's narrowing the gap between where humanity is and where it needs to be. Because money at this scale only makes sense if it's deployed against existential constraints, energy scarcity, planetary fragility, interplanetary vulnerability, and technological stagnation. And I know there will be debates about fairness, governance, and power, and those debates should happen. But I also know that none of this would exist without an appetite for risk that most people understandably avoid, because betting your reputation, fortune, and sanity on outcomes that might not materialize is not a comfortable way to live. And yet that discomfort is where progress tends to hide. And if this chapter of my story proves anything, it's that radical accountability paired with radical ambition can produce results that look absurd until they're suddenly real. And as the world keeps refreshing its rankings and safe rewriting its superlatives, I'm already mentally elsewhere, thinking about the next bottleneck, the next constraint, the next improbable target that, if hit, will once again make today's numbers look small. And somewhere between the applause and the outrage, between the memes and the think pieces, I started to notice how quickly people try to freeze a moment in time to turn a moving system into a statue, because it's comforting to believe that history pauses when a record is broken, but it doesn't. It keeps accelerating, and the irony of being labeled the richest person in history is that it coincides with a period where I feel an increasing urgency rather than satisfaction. Because capital without velocity is just stored potential. And potential that isn't used decays into irrelevance. And I've seen that happen to companies, to governments, to civilizations that mistook accumulated success for permanence. And I refuse to make that mistake, because the same forces that amplified my net worth can just as easily amplify failure if attention drifts or standards slip. And I think about how the Delaware ruling wasn't really about me as an individual. It was about whether extreme ambition still has legal and institutional room to exist in a system that often prefers predictability over progress. And when that door stayed open, it sent a signal far beyond Tesla, a signal that long-term value creation tied to measurable outcomes can still survive scrutiny even when it makes people uncomfortable. And discomfort is something I've grown used to, whether it's sleeping on factory floors, launching rockets that the internet is convinced will explode, or buying platforms everyone says are unfixable. And I've learned that resistance often scales with impact, because if you're not provoking strong reactions, you're probably not changing anything meaningful. And as my wealth eclipsed every historical comparison, I didn't think about yachts or monuments or legacy in the traditional sense. I thought about bandwidth, about how much faster problems can be solved when constraints are removed, when timelines compress, when engineers don't have to wait for permission from risk-averse committees. And I also thought about how fragile public perception is, how quickly admiration flips to suspicion, and how irrelevant that flip becomes if you stay focused on first principles, because physics doesn't care about opinions, and markets eventually bow to execution.